Hello, everyone. My name is Flora. I am married to Daniel Bryan. Felt like stepping into another universe. His family, the Bryans, were the epitome of high society. Wealthy, influential, and, to an outsider, intimidating. Their estate was a sprawling masterpiece, with every inch meticulously manicured and every room a testament to their wealth. Walking through those halls, I felt like a character in a movie. It was breathtaking and, admittedly, a bit overwhelming. In the beginning, I was naively optimistic, believing that love was enough to bridge the gap. But the Bryans had their own rules, their own way of doing things. It was like an unspoken game, and I was the only one who didn't know the rules. Harry, Daniel's older brother, was the ringleader. He had this way of making you feel insignificant without raising his voice. "So, Flora, this must be a big change from where you grew up, huh?" he would say, his voice dripping with condescension, his eyes scanning me like I was an exhibit. I tried to laugh it off, replying, "Every day is an adventure, Harry. I'm just trying to keep up." Then there were the dinners, where every word felt like a test, and every silence was loaded with meaning. Mrs. Bryan, with her piercing gaze, always found a way to remind me of my humble origins. "It's so brave of you, Flora, to step into our world. Not everyone can adapt to such refinement," she'd say. But I was determined not to let them get to me. I wanted to prove that I was more than what they saw, more than just the girl from the other side of the tracks who had managed to snag the good son of a wealthy family. Then I found out I was pregnant. Suddenly, there was this flicker of hope. Maybe this baby would be the bridge between me and the Bryans, something that would soften them and make them see me as one of their own. When I told Daniel, his face lit up as if I had just handed him the world. "We're going to have a baby, Em. Can you believe it? You're going to be an amazing mom," he said. I clung to that optimism, thinking maybe, just maybe, this baby could change everything. But life has a way of not playing by your rules. Instead of bringing the family closer, the news of my pregnancy seemed to light the fuse of an already ticking bomb. The Bryans had always been about wealth and inheritance, and my baby represented a shift in a balance they weren't ready for. Harry's animosity became more apparent. It started subtly, a snide comment here, a backhanded compliment there. "A baby, huh? Dad's going to have to rethink his will now." "Congratulations, Flora," he said once, his smile not reaching his eyes. The tension in the house grew thicker each day. I tried to keep my distance, but living under the same roof felt like being constantly watched by vultures waiting for a carcass. One day, it all came crashing down. Daniel was delayed at work, and I was alone with Mrs. Bryan and Harry. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken anger and resentment. The confrontation started over something trivial. I think I had moved a vase to dust around it, but it escalated quickly. "You think you can just come in here and change everything?" Harry's voice was cold, his eyes flashing with anger. "I was just cleaning, Harry. I didn't mean to upset anyone," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Cleaning or snooping around? We know your game, Flora. You're nothing but a gold digger trying to secure your child's future at our expense." Mrs. Bryan chimed in, her voice dripping with disdain. I felt trapped, the walls of the opulent living room closing in on me. "That's not true. I love Daniel, and this baby, our baby, is a blessing," I managed to say, but my voice was trembling. Then it happened. In a moment of rage, Harry stepped forward and pushed me. I fell hard onto the ground. The pain was immediate, and I knew something was terribly wrong. I lay there, cradling my stomach as Harry and Mrs. Bryan stood over me. There was a moment of shock on their faces, but no remorse. "Look what you made me do," Harry muttered, more to himself than to me. When Daniel finally came home, he found me in a state of shock, bruises forming, tears streaming down my face. Between sobs and gasps of pain, I told him everything. Daniel's reaction was a mix of horror, anger, and disbelief. He helped me up, his arms around me, his eyes burning with fury. We're leaving Flora tonight. I won't let them hurt you or our baby anymore." We packed in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. As we drove away from the Bryan estate, I felt a sense of relief mixed with deep, overwhelming sadness. But the worst was yet to come. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed our fears. We had lost the baby. The fall, the trauma, it was too much. Lying in that hospital bed, with Daniel by my side, everything felt surreal. The Bryans, their estate, their wealth, none of it mattered anymore. All I could think about was the baby we lost, the future we had dreamed of, gone in an instant. Leaving the Bryan estate was like stepping out of a storm into an uncertain calm. Daniel and I were broken, trying to piece together our lives after the loss. We moved into a small apartment, a stark contrast to the grandeur we had left behind, but it became our sanctuary. Those first few weeks were tough. Daniel threw himself into work, while I struggled to find my footing in a world that suddenly felt so different. We talked less, the silence between us filled with the unspoken grief of what we had lost. But amidst our sorrow, there was a glimmer of light. Daniel's father, Mr. Bryan, was the antithesis of the rest of his family. Where they were cold, he was warm. Where they were calculating, he was genuine. He visited often, always with a kind word and a listening ear. "Flora, my dear, I'm so sorry for what happened. Your family, and you always will be," he'd say, his eyes filled with a sincerity that was rare in his family. His visits were a balm to our aching hearts. He never pushed, never pried, just offered his support and love. It was Mr. Bryan who helped us see that life could still be beautiful, that we could rebuild from our loss. Then something miraculous happened. I discovered I was pregnant again. The joy was immediate, but so was the fear. The memory of our loss was still too fresh, too painful. However, with Daniel and Mr. Bryan's support, I allowed myself to feel a cautious hope. Daniel's face, when I told him about the pregnancy, was a mix of happiness and fear. "We're going to be extra careful this time. I'm not letting anything happen to you or our baby," he said. Mr. Bryan was overjoyed when he heard the news. "A new beginning," he said, his eyes shining with tears. "This child, Flora, is a blessing, a sign that life goes on no matter what." But fate had a cruel twist in store. Just when things seemed to be looking up, we received the news. Mr. Bryan had passed away unexpectedly. It was a shock that shook us to our core. He had been our rock, our safe harbor in the storm that was his family. The brief period of mourning that followed was overshadowed by the palpable greed of the Bryan family. It was like vultures circling, waiting to see what they could claim from Mr. Bryan's legacy. As we grieved the loss of a truly good man, it became clear that the battle for the Bryan inheritance was just beginning. But in that moment, all I could think about was the baby growing inside me, a symbol of hope in a time of darkness. After Mr. Bryan's passing, the atmosphere within the Bryan family shifted palpably. The solemnity of mourning was quickly overshadowed by a barely concealed eagerness for the inheritance. It was like watching actors in a poorly scripted play, their grief giving way to greed. Daniel and I attended the reading of the will with a sense of dread. The rest of the Bryan family was abuzz with anticipation, speculating about their shares of the estate. The lawyer cleared his throat, opening the will. You could have heard a pin drop. "Mr. Bryan has made some specific allocations in his will," he began, his voice formal and emotionless. As the lawyer read on, shock rippled through the room. Mr. Bryan had left a significant portion of his estate to me and our unborn child, ensuring our financial security and independence. Harry's face was a picture of disbelief and anger. "This can't be right. He's leaving money to her and her child." His voice was laced with venom. Mrs. Bryan was equally incredulous, her shock mirroring Harry's. "But that's our inheritance. How could he do this?" Harry's voice seethed with anger, his eyes blazing with disbelief. The lawyer, unfazed by the outburst, continued calmly. Mr. Bryan was very clear in his intentions. He wanted to ensure that Flora and her child are well taken care of. I sat there, stunned and humbled by Mr. Bryan's foresight and kindness. Daniel squeezed my hand, his expression a mix of sadness and gratitude. "Dad always knew what was right," he whispered. The rest of the reading passed in a blur, with Harry and Mrs. Bryan exchanging whispered arguments and shooting angry glares our way. But something had shifted within me. I felt a newfound strength, a resolve to stand up against their greed and malice. After the reading, the backlash was immediate. "You manipulated my father," Harry accused, his face flushed with rage. "I did no such thing," I replied, my voice steady. "Your father was a kind man who saw what was happening in his own house." Mrs. Bryan tried to interject, but Daniel stepped in. "Enough. Dad made his choice, and we will respect it. Flora and our child deserve this." As we left the lawyer's office, the weight of the Bryan family's animosity bore down on us. But there was also a sense of liberation. We were no longer bound to them, no longer tethered to their toxic world. That day marked a turning point for me. I was no longer the outsider trying to fit in. I was a mother-to-be, a woman with a newfound purpose, ready to protect my family against whatever the Bryans might throw our way. The birth of my son was the beginning of a new chapter in my life. After so much pain and loss, holding him in my arms felt like a piece of heaven had been handed to me. His tiny fingers, his soft cries, they were symbols of hope, of a future finally looking bright. Daniel was an incredible father, his love and support unwavering. We named our son Leo, a name that meant strong and enduring. It suited him, and it suited us, a family that had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. Meanwhile, the Bryan family's world began to crumble. The inheritance, or the lack thereof, hit them hard. Harry, consumed by greed and anger, found himself embroiled in legal troubles. His shady business dealings, once overlooked due to his father's influence, were now in the spotlight. He faced lawsuits and financial ruin, his fall from grace a stark contrast to his former arrogance. Mrs. Bryan's life took a downward spiral as well. Without the financial cushion she was accustomed to, her lavish lifestyle became unsustainable. The friends she once hosted with such grandeur began to distance themselves, leaving her in a lonely, self-made exile. As for Daniel and me, we built a life filled with love and laughter, far from the toxic environment of the Bryan estate. I started a small business, something I had always dreamed of but never had the courage to pursue. To my joy and surprise, it flourished. Daniel found success in his career too, his integrity and hard work paying off. We were a team in every sense of the word, building a life on our terms, away from the shadows of the Bryan legacy. One evening, as I watched Leo play, Daniel came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "We did it, Em. We made it through," he said softly. I leaned back into his embrace, a smile in my voice. "We did," I replied, "and we have so much to be thankful for." Looking back, the journey was anything but easy. There were moments of despair, of heartache. But there were also moments of incredible strength, of love that refused to be diminished. In the end, justice was served, not just in the downfall of the Bryans, but in the life we built out of the ashes of that ordeal. We found joy, not in their misery, but in our own triumph, in our ability to rise above and create something beautiful out of something so broken. The story has reached its conclusion, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. But before you go, I have a question for you. In a world filled with challenges and difficult decisions, what do you believe is the true measure of victory? Is it revenge or the ability to find peace and build a better life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's have a thoughtful discussion.